is that one should realize that the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is established upon the tawheed of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It is the very purpose of our creation, as Allah Jalla wa Ala has stated, وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسَ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ. I did not create the jinn, nor the mankind, except that they should worship me alone. This was indeed the purpose for the sending of all of the prophets and all of the messengers. As Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, وَلَقَدْ بَعَثْنَا فِي كُلِّ أُمَّةٍ رَسُولًا أَنْ يَعْبُدُوا اللَّهَ وَاجْتَنِبُوا الطَّاغُوتَ. That we did not send a messenger except to every single nation, calling them to the worship of Allah and away from the worship of everything besides Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And likewise, as that which was stated to the messenger of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by Allah Jalla wa Ala, where Allah said, وَمَا أَرْسَلْنَا مِن قَبْلِكَ مِن رَسُولٍ إِلَّا نُوحِي إِلَيْهِ أَنَّهُ لَا إِلَهَ إِلَّا أَنَا فَاعْبُدُونَ. The statement of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, وَمَا أَرْسَلْنَا مِن قَبْلِكَ. That we did not send before you, O messenger, meaning Muhammad, we did not send before you a messenger, except that we inspired him to say that there is nothing worthy of worship except for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the call of all of the prophets and all of the messengers began with, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has said, يَا قَوْمِ اعْبُدُوا اللَّهَ مَا لَكُمْ مِنْ إِلَهٍ غَيْرُهُ. O my people, worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone. So servitude to Allah, worship Him. And you have no one else, or you have nothing worthy of worship other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this was the message of Islam, and it continues to be the message of Islam. The distortion that has occurred amongst the Muslims in the last century, 20th century Miladi or 20th century of the Christian era, and the 15th century of Al-Islam, that Islam in its mainstream has become deviated and polluted by the ideology of politicization, or this ideology of becoming highly politicized with regard to the affairs of the Ummah. So much so that many of the people now believe that the ideology of Al-Islam, and they call it an ideology, even though Islam is not an ideology, it is an aqidah, it is a creed, and it is faith, and it is action. It increases with obedience to Allah and it decreases with disobedience to Allah. That they claim that Islam is an ideology that calls to politics, and it is a political ideology. So no one from those who wish to practice Islam, as they claim, should be unaware of the political situation in the world, wherever that may be. So therefore they politicize the Muslim youth, they politicize the Muslim communities, and they regard this as the most important call. So much so that they claim that the whole reason of the sending of the prophets and the messengers was for the establishment of the Khilafah, as has been stated by Sayyid Ala Mawdudi, one of the ideologues of the modern day political activists. That Sayyid Ala Mawdudi said that the purpose of the sending of all of the prophets and all of the messengers was for the purpose of the establishment of the Dawla Islamiyya, the establishment of the Islamic State. So every single prophet was sent to establish the Islamic State. This was the statement of Sayyid Ala Mawdudi, the founder of Jamaat al-Islami of Pakistan. And he wrote this in his book called At-Tajdeed. And this of course opposes that which all of the prophets and all of the messengers came with. To the extent that Mawdudi even states that every single prophet either came to revolt or to call for revolution against the ruler, or to prepare the ground for the revolution to occur after the prophet had finished. And some of the prophets succeeded in establishing the Islamic State, and some of them were not successful. This is what he claims. And this of course is looking at Islam through the vision, or through the visionary ideology of these people of innovation and people of bid'ah, who have made every single aspect of Islam rotate around siyasa, politics, and the affairs of politics. So much so that they claim that the way that they guide their murids, those who are under them, that they teach them first and foremost to become politically aware of the world situation. So they encourage them to read the newspapers and to read the magazines and to look at the websites of politics and current affairs. And so much so that their follower can become a scholar of politics in 2 nights, in 48 hours. He was 48 hours previous, he was a jahil, ignorant, didn't know what he was. And after 48 hours, he becomes a member of their organization, a fighter for the cause, and a person who has become enlightened about Islam and its branches due to him surfing the internet and due to him watching the various channels that portray the current affairs. And this is complete contrary to that which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His Messenger sallallahu alayhi wa sallam had commanded the people with. Indeed, we believe as Muslims that the nasr or the aid is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the aid of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will come to the believers, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will give establishment to the believers so long as they fulfill that which Allah has commanded them with. As Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala stated, وَأَذَى اللَّهُ الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا مِنْكُمْ وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ. That is the pledge from your Lord for those amongst you who believe and work righteous deeds. لَيَسْتَخْلِفَنَّهُمْ فِي الْأَرْضِ كَمَا اسْتَخْلِفَ الَّذِينَ مِنْ قَبْلِهِمْ. That He will establish you in the earth as just as He established those who came before them. وَلَا يُمَكِّنَنَّ لَهُمْ دِينَهُمْ الَّذِي ارْتَضَىٰ لَهُمْ. And He will establish for them their religion, the religion that Allah is pleased with. وَلَا يُبَدِّلَنَّهُمْ مِنْ بَعْدِ خَوْفِهِمْ أَمْنًا. That Allah will change their condition, a condition of fear and insecurity in which they were living, and Allah will change that to a state of tranquility and security. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sets down, as Shaykh al-Fawzan mentions, Allah lays down a condition. What is the condition? The condition is, as Allah has stated at the end of the ayah, يَعْبُدُونَنِي لَا يُشْرِكُونَ بِي شَيْئًا. So long as they worship Me alone and they do not associate partners with Me. So here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions 4 things for the believers, or 4 things for the people, for the worshippers. And due to that, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will give them 2 things. The 4 things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has commanded with is, as Allah has mentioned, a pledge from your Lord for those of you who have iman, that they have the correct aqidah, the correct iman, and they work righteous deeds, meaning that followed on from the correct aqidah is that they implement that correct aqidah that has a reflection upon the limbs, and it is that a person does the good actions and the righteous deeds, does that which Allah has commanded, keeps away from that which Allah has forbidden. So firstly, that as Allah has said, a pledge from your Lord for those of you who believe, have iman, the correct aqidah, the aqidah of tawheed, worshipping Allah alone, believing in Allah and His angels and His books, and believing in the messengers, believing in the final day, the hellfire, the paradise, and so on and so forth, and likewise believing in the pre-decree. And each one of these is established with the various texts of the Quran and the Sunnah. And you work righteous deeds, you establish the prayer, you pay the zakah, you give the sadaqah, you're obedient to your parents, you fulfill the rights of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, keeping away from that which He has forbidden. Those are the righteous actions. And then Allah has said what He will do in response to that. As Allah has stated, وَأَذَى اللَّهُ الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا مِنْكُمْ وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ لَيَسْتَخْلِفَنَّهُمْ فِي الْأَرْضِ. That Allah will give them establishment, the Khilafah upon the earth, establishment upon the earth, due to their aqidah, due to their righteous deeds. And then Allah mentions another thing that the believers must do, 2 more things that the believers must do. And these 2 conditions must be fulfilled before the victory of Allah comes to the believers. يَعْبُدُونَنِي لَا يُشْرِكُونَ بِي شَيْئًا. That they worship Me alone and they do not associate partners with Me. 2 more things. As Shaykh al-Fawzan mentions, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not only say يَعْبُدُونَنِي, but Allah also said لَا يُشْرِكُونَ بِي شَيْئًا. That not that you only worship Me alone, but you do not associate anything in worship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if these conditions are met, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will give the believers, the worshippers of Allah, establishment upon the earth. So people who believe that the Khilafah is something that will be achieved, or establishment upon the earth and security upon the earth will be achieved by they themselves alone, that they are the ones who will strive for it, even though they don't have the correct aqeedah, even if they don't work righteous actions, even if others besides Allah are worshipped in their own families and amongst their own midst, and they don't call for the rectification of the greatest and most important thing. Because a person who commits every sin from the major sins that do not exit a person from the fold of Islam, such as fornication, adultery, stealing, lying, killing, whichever sin that you can think of from the major sins that don't exit the person from the fold of Islam. From these major sins, if a person commits all of them, and alongside of that he worships Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone, and he does not associate partners in worship with Allah, this person will eventually enter into paradise due to his tawheed. Due to his tawheed. And as for the person who worships other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and he does not establish tawheed, but he strives all of his life in these activities, such as, for example, that he claims, like you find some of those Sufis, that they want to establish the Islamic State. So they work and work and work in the establishment, as they claim, of the Islamic State. But he worships the dead in his grave. But all of his life he worked to establish the Khilafah. But this one single thing that he does, which is to worship partners, associate partners alongside Allah in worship, will forbid him from entering into paradise eternally, due to the fact that he committed shirk alongside Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And how many Muslims in the world do we find today? How many Muslims in the world? Millions of them, who are worshipping other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who are associating partners with Allah, or they allow the association of partners with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and they do not forbid it, and they allow it to continue in their midst, because they believe that the greatest goal is the establishment of the Islamic State. Not realizing that the establishment of the Islamic State, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has mentioned the ayah that we mentioned, that the establishment of the Islamic State is set upon the condition that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone is worshipped. يَعْبُدُونَنِي لَا يُشْرِكُونَ بِي شَيْئًا. So how can they establish the Islamic State in a place where graves are worshipped, idols are worshipped? People are not forbidden from the greatest crime before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has stated, إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يَغْفِرُ أَن يُشْرَكَ بِهِ وَيَغْفِرُ مَا دُونَ ذَلِكَ لِمَن يَشَاءُ. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has said that Allah will not forgive that partners are associated with Him in worship, but He will forgive lesser than that to whomsoever He pleases. So the unforgivable crimes of shirk is being committed in their midst, and they're telling those people, ignore this shirk. The most important thing is what's happening in America, what's happening in Iraq, what's happening in this place, what's happening in that place. Even if the situation in Iraq and Palestine was to continue for the next 1,000 years, if the situation of Palestine and Iraq was to continue, and the people were upon shirk, Iraq continuing or Palestine continuing, is of no significance as compared to the shirk that is committed alongside Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. As alongside the shirk that is committed, compared to the shirk that is committed alongside Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So it is amazing that in the time of the deepest of oppression of the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam and his companions in Mecca for 13 years, when the idols were being worshipped around the Kaaba, 360 of them, and yet the thing that the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam called to was Tawheed, was to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone. This is the purpose of His sending, the purpose of the sending of every prophet and messenger before the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, without exception. And when the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam sent Mu'adh bin Jabal to Yemen, he said to Mu'adh bin Jabal, let the first thing, you are going to the people from Ahlul Kitab, that the first thing that you call them to is that they establish the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. First thing that you call them to. So if this is the case with the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam sending his own disciples, the companions, to Yemen, to call the people to the Tawheed of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, why has the call today changed? Why has the call in the eyes of these people, like Maududi, like Sayyid Qutb, like the likes of Bin Laden, When Bin Laden was asked the question, they said to him that at the moment it is quite possible that there will be over 1 billion people watching you. This was in the mid-90s. Over 1 billion people watching you. What would you tell them? He said, I tell them that every single Muslim should take an American and kill him. So the message of the Anbiya was what? Ya qawmi a'budullaha. Oh my people, worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You do not have anyone worthy of worship besides Him. The message of these people: kill, murder, destroy, cause carnage, cause mayhem, kill Muslims and non-Muslims indiscriminately. That's the message of these people. All in the name of what? As they claim to establish the rule of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala upon the earth.